Hey, I'm out here on the Pecos River this morning and just kind of watching the water flow down. It's spring. We've got, these cool clouds going by. Sometimes the sun breaks out, then it goes away, then it breaks out. So it's kind of a neat lighting condition we got down here this morning. I just wanted to take a minute and kind of talk about doing a scene like this. I mean, I can come in here and I've set up a composition. I've thought through my composition, and I'm just experimenting. Usually in a scene, in a landscape, I might take some time on the composition, do 1 or 2 compositions, and then just focus on those and really doing them well. But a lot of times the creativity on things like this, it can come down to the exposure too. And I've had some people asking me questions about neutral density filters and exposure and things like that. And I just wanted to take a few minutes. When you take a scene like this, and so right now I'm at a 60th of a second at f13, ISO 160. My water is in the zone 6 to 7 range, and then I have some highlights up there in those clouds that are pushing zone 9 even into zone 10 or pure white. But I'm shooting with a raw file on the Sony a7R II, and it has phenomenal dynamic range. So I know that I'm going to be able to draw that down and bring out that dynamic range in post-production to fulfill my visualization. Now I'm thinking, how can I add creativity to the scene? And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on a neutral density filter. So of course, a neutral density filter is just darkening the scene. And long exposures can totally change the way we see the world. So you think of a scene like this and you do long exposures, and suddenly you have, little wisps in the branches and the water's flowing. So especially with water and moving subjects, the long exposure can be beautiful. Of course, you can use long exposure techniques in portraits and all kinds of things, but there's just a lot of power in the long exposure. Now, essentially long exposures, they use pretty basic math. Here's my 0.9, which this should be 3 stops. And then I have my favorite, which is my B&W 110. The B&W 110 is a 10-stop neutral density filter. Now a 10-stop, so this is a 10-stop, so this is an ND3, which is a 10-stop reduction in light. I prefer to use the stops rather than the designation number of the filter. Let me just clean it off here as I work. So 10 stops is 1,000x reduction in light. Now the world totally changes when you do 10 stops. And I use my lesser filters quite a bit too, but I do love my 10 stops. So I got a 7mm 10 stop ND here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give my base exposure. Now there's calculators and all kinds of things, but I want to give you some tips about neutral density filters, because what you have here, and let me just dial in my light a little bit, and I'm going to adjust my ISO just a little bit so I can kind of get some even numbers, right? And so I'm going to go and dial this down to 1/100th of a second, and I'm just going to lighten it up a little with the ISO. So I keep my relative exposure right where I want it. And I got the midtones of the water about zone 6. I'm at ISO 250 at 100th of a second. Now, here's what happens with a neutral density filter is it's just a stop. And as we talk about in the exposure workshop, it's just doubles and halves. The doubles and halves principle makes this very simple. So I could use an app and a calculator, and I've done that before, but really all I have to do is say, well, I'm at 100th of a second now. If I put a 3-stop ND filter on, I'm going to go down to 3 stops lower. So I'm just doubling and halving. So in this case, I'm reducing the light by 3 stops, which means I need to have my exposure time by 3 stops. So what would that be? Well, I'm at 100th right now. I would go 50th, 25th, 13th of a second. So if I had a 3-stop filter, it'd be about a 13th of a second. Now, I have to keep going though if I'm using a 10-stop. And so in that case, it would be, okay, I'd take my shutter speed. I'm building my composition. This camera is actually sensitive enough that I can compose with a 10-stop filter on. A lot of cameras are going to be so dark with a 10-stop filter on that you want to do your composing before, and quite frankly, I usually prefer to do it that way anyhow, just because of the results it gives me. Okay, so I'm going to start going down now. 1 stop is a 50th, 2 stops is a 25th, 3 stops a 13th, a 6 is 4 stops, 3rd 5 stops, 0.6, 6 stops, 1.37 stops, okay? 2.5, 8 stops, See, now we start doubling. 5 seconds, 9 stops, 10 seconds, 10 stops. Okay, so we started at 100th of a second, and I think I got my math right. Forgive me if in my haste I got it wrong, but we'll see how the exposure comes out. I'm gonna run 10 seconds with this 10 stop neutral density filter in the same scene here. So I'm still at f11, ISO 250, and we're just gonna run that 10-second exposure on this same scene. Now the thing is, so I could adjust more or less, right? If I wanted just a 2-second exposure, honestly, I'd probably just use the 3-stop filter. But I could say, well, let's adjust my ISO so my base exposure without a filter is, let's say, 50th of a second or 25th of a second. And I could easily get this exposure up into a couple of minutes and completely change the result. Now here's the advantage and the differences you see with that. Right now, we've got the exposure. And now the water is clear and crystal and silky and a little bit of movement in the clouds. But let's say we start it differently, okay? So I'm gonna go and I wanna double this. So I'm gonna drop my ISO. Rather than recalculate everything again, remember, it's the doubles and halves principle of exposure. The doubles and halves principle, I'm just gonna go down from 250 to 125th ISO, which means at the same aperture, I can now get 20 seconds exposure, okay? And I'm gonna run that exposure. Now here's a tip that I found when you're using long exposures. Once you get into 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, in my experience, you tend to be more underexposed than overexposed most of the time. Meaning, let's say I'm doing a long scene and I expose it and the setup is working and then I calculate it out and I say, well, this needs to be 3 minutes. Sometimes I might push it to 3 minutes, 10 seconds or something like that. It's science, but you bring a little bit of art into it as well because you've got to get a feel for when does my tone values come out where they want. It just seems, personally to me, that yes, there is the exact science of exposure, but sometimes I want to push it a little more when I get into those really long exposures to bring out the look that I want. Now what we're starting to get here is an interesting image because we're seeing the total smoothness of the water. So a 20-second exposure is making that water nice and glassy. Now we could take this further, however, with a really long exposure, okay? So we could go and do this differently. I could take another tact, and at this point, I would have to have a cable release. Once you get over 30 seconds on most cameras, you have to have that cable release. Okay, so let's do it. Let's do something a little different. Now, this may not be the best image ever. It may not be my best light ever, but this is a great testing area because we have a little bit of breeze on the trees. We have the water moving. It's a really nice scene. Okay. I'm gonna have it again. I'm gonna go down to 64 ISO. And I'm gonna give myself 40 seconds now. Now, of course, that has to be in bulb mode. Once we're at that point, it has to be a bulb. Now, I'm gonna do one more thing though. I'm gonna go to f16. And I'm gonna give myself about 80 seconds. And I might push it up to about 100 just for good measure, like I was just talking about, just to bring out my highlights a little bit more. Okay, so I'm gonna put my cable release in here and I'm gonna bulb this and we're just gonna take 100 seconds, more or less. As you get into the really long exposures, a second more or less is not night and day because you're talking about so long. Of course, in a normal exposure, a second is a ton of time. Once you're well over a minute, a second up or down, obviously we want the best exposure we can get, but it changes a lot slower. So I'm gonna start this off and count it off. Okay, so now we're doing our long exposure noise reduction and I ran exposure right about 90 seconds on this one and we'll just see how that comes out. Now, I'll typically use a long exposure noise reduction on these long ones, regardless of my ISO, just to get as clean of an image as I can. Of course, you can experiment on that and find out what works best for you. Here's the bottom line of the tips with the neutral density filters and with long exposures in general. First of all, a neutral density filter can get you long exposures in any situation, and that becomes a powerful thing. Second of all, when you use it, by all means use a calculator if you need to, but the main thing is to get the shot. And so if you spend so much time tinkering that you never set up and get your composition and get your image, you may have a problem. So understanding the doubles and the halves principle makes it really easy to use neutral density filters. You can also take a handheld meter like my spot meter, and you can actually meter through a neutral density filter in many cases. Sometimes that gets a little tricky with a 10x neutral density filter because it's so dark. It's like a welding mask or something over the lens of your camera. The third thing is just take your time. Make sure you're stable on a tripod, check your composition, get a setup first, right? Then put your ND filter on and finish your image and get a nice exposure, because it does take extra time and planning to make a long exposure work. Think about what branches and what water is going to do. Think about where you position yourself in relation to that. A lot of this all comes down to seeing your space and your position and your line and your tone, things that we've talked about in many other videos. So when you're making long exposures, look around, and even if you're not thinking in long exposure mode, sometimes stop and think in long exposure mode. Say, well, what happens if I do a long exposure? Now, you don't always need a neutral density filter for long exposures, particularly at night and things like that. But if you think outside the box in long exposure, meaning, hey, let's do a 60-second exposure instead of just a 1-second exposure, the whole world starts to change in ways that you can't always predict, and it can produce beautiful, beautiful visualizations when you carry that image through to the finished product. There's lots of different ways to do it. At night, I can do a long exposure with stars and get the trails. During the day, I can do a long exposure with water and get silkiness or glassiness in the water. And I can take this another direction too. With that understanding of exposure, I can go in at night and say, well, I don't want the long exposures. I don't want the trails. So what's the longest exposure I can get without the stars blurring? And so you can get more deep field work with stars and landscapes. A lot of long exposures and ND filters and working with this, it really enhances your understanding of light, exposure, and exposure time, and it'll make your images more powerful. Let me just see what we got here. And this is very neat. At this point, now we're actually getting some blurring in the clouds, and it's becoming a very interesting exposure. And just take a look here and see what you think. Now, we went about 90 seconds. There's a little bit of a lack of detail in the clouds. And what I might do is cut this back down to about 40 seconds. So I'm gonna do a 40-second by just dropping down my my aperture a stop. And instead of 80, I'm gonna do 40 of this same scene and just kind of watching these clouds up here. Okay, so we got 41, 42 seconds on that one. Now, let's see what's next, and we'll see how this comes out. Now this is very nice, but we still have a lot of light in that sky. That sky's actually lightening up. And so if I check my metering on the sky, and let's actually do that. But if we have a little less, look, I want that sky in the zone 9 range max on the highlight. So, and then I want my foreground in the zone, maybe 4 in the shadows, and then 5 or so in the water. So I'm gonna run another one, and actually I'm gonna come out of bulb mode now. And I'm gonna run a 25 second and just see what happens here. F11 at ISO 64. When I'm doing a longer exposure, I'm gonna look for a sweet spot. It's not about making it as long as I can. It's not about making it long for the sake of it. If I'm making a long exposure, I want there to be cause for it. And so what I'll usually do is set up my composition of whatever it is, whether it's a portrait scene or a landscape scene. Now, of course, for the portrait scene, if I'm doing long exposure, it's usually gonna be a lot shorter. With landscapes is when I usually get into the long creative exposures. Now, what I'm gonna do is I'll experiment, just like we're doing here, and I'll say, well, let's do a longer one, let's do a shorter one. Let's find what really brings out the beauty of the scene, and then use that as our final. Now, I've got more detail in the clouds here, but we do have a large ratio, and that's why this high dynamic range sensor on here is gonna be good for me. I've got the clouds to where I'm mostly maintaining, but I'm actually gonna do one shorter one at about 20 seconds, just to make sure I'm not losing it in the clouds. Especially on a gray day like this, if you clip those clouds and they just become white, it ruins your image. It doesn't have the impact that you're gonna need. So we'll do a 20 second, and in effect, we're actually bracketing at this point. Usually I'll end up using my one favorite exposure when I do a handful of images like this of the same composition, but we are bracketing, and so if we did need to do some blending or some HDR mapping, we could do that. Excellent. Well, we got some nice images. Now I'm gonna take a little bit different tack. And I'm gonna focus on changing my perspective. So I've all these images I made are this one composition, right? And so I'm gonna drop down and see about doing the composition from another perspective.